A 10-year-old boy vanished during what should have been a fun sleepover at his best friend's house in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, leaving behind only his pajamas and a family devastated by unanswered questions. For 15 years, Carol Brennan believed her son Tommy had been taken by a stranger who somehow slipped into the Peterson house undetected. But when she discovers Tommy's Spider-Man backpack hidden deep in Mr. I. Peterson's storage unit, the truth that emerges is more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. A revelation that would shatter everything she thought she knew about that October night in 1989. The autumn leaves crunched under Carol Brennan's feet as she walked up the familiar driveway of 847 Maple Street, Tommy's overnight bag slung over her shoulder. The Peterson house looked exactly as it always did. White colonial with green shutters, perfectly manicured lawn, and a basketball hoop where she'd watched her son play countless games with his best friend Danny. "Mom, you're embarrassing me," Tommy groaned from beside her, his sandy brown hair falling into his eyes the way it always did when he needed a haircut. At 10 years old, he was all knees and elbows, growing faster than Carol could keep up with his clothing sizes. "I'm just walking you to the door, sweetie." Carol laughed, ruffling his hair. "That's what moms do." The front door opened before they could knock, and Danny Peterson bounded out, his face lit up with excitement. "Tommy, Dad said we can stay up until midnight and watch horror movies." "Really?" Tommy's eyes widened with the kind of pure joy that only children could manage over something so simple. Carol felt a familiar flutter of worry in her stomach. "Not too scary, right? You know how Tommy gets nightmares." "Don't worry, Mrs. Brennan," came a deep voice from the doorway. Bill Peterson stepped out, wiping his hands on a dish towel. At 38, he was a handsome man with dark hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He'd been nothing but helpful since Carol's divorce 2 years ago, always offering to take Tommy to baseball practice when she had to work late at the hospital. "Just some classic monster movies," Bill continued. "Nothing too intense, and I'll be right there with them." Carol studied his face, finding nothing but genuine warmth. Bill had been Danny's father for all of the boys' 10 years, and in that time, she'd never seen him be anything but patient and caring with both boys. If anything, he seemed more attentive than most fathers she knew. "Where's Susan tonight?" Carol asked, noticing Danny's mother was nowhere to be seen. "Book club," Bill replied with a slight eye roll. "You know how she is about her romance novels. Won't be back until late." Carol nodded, feeling satisfied. Tommy would be in good hands. "Okay, but Tommy, you behave yourself, and if you get scared, you call me immediately." "Mom," Tommy protested, his cheeks reddening. "I'm not a baby." "I know, sweetheart." Carol kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo. "I love you. Love you too," Tommy mumbled, already heading toward the house with Danny. "I'll have him home by noon tomorrow," Bill called out as the boys disappeared inside. Carol waved and walked back to her car, glancing once more at the house. Everything seemed normal, safe. She had no way of knowing it would be the last time she'd ever see her son alive. The call came at 6:47 a.m. Carol jolted awake to the shrill ring of her bedside phone, her heart immediately racing. Calls at dawn were never good news, especially for someone who worked in a hospital emergency room. "Hello?" she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Carol, it's Bill Peterson." His voice was tight, strained in a way she'd never heard before. "I'm so sorry to wake you, but Tommy isn't here." "What do you mean he isn't there?" Carol sat up straight, suddenly fully awake. "I went to wake the boys up for breakfast and Danny was in his sleeping bag, but Tommy's was empty. I've searched the whole house. His shoes are still by the door, but he's nowhere to be found." Carol's world tilted sideways. "That's impossible. Where could he have gone?" "I don't know. I've been looking for an hour. I called the police. They're on their way." Carol was already out of bed, reaching for her jeans. "I'm coming over." "Carol, I'm so sorry. I don't understand how this could have happened. I was right down the hall." The line went dead, leaving Carol alone with the terrible silence of her empty house. Her hands shook as she pulled on her clothes, her mind racing through possibilities. Tommy was a sound sleeper. He wouldn't just wander off. Someone must have taken him. But how? And why? 20 minutes later, Carol stood in the Petersons' living room, surrounded by police officers and the debris of what had clearly been a fun evening. Popcorn bowls sat on the coffee table, empty soda cans scattered around 2 sleeping bags. Tommy's bag lay flat and empty, his Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles pajamas folded neatly beside it. "Mrs. Brennan?" A tall detective with graying hair approached her. "I'm Detective Martinez. I need to ask you some questions about your son." Carol nodded. though everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life fall apart. "Has Tommy ever sleepwalked?" Martinez asked. "Never. He's always been a heavy sleeper." "Any problems at home?" "Divorce can be hard on kids." "Maybe he wanted to run away?" "No," Carol said firmly. "Tommy was happy. He loved spending time with Danny. There's no way he would have left on his own." Detective Martinez made notes, his expression neutral. "We've searched the house in the immediate area. No signs of forced entry. Mr. Peterson says he checked on the boys around 11 p.m., and they were both asleep." "Someone took him," Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone came into this house and took my son." Martinez exchanged glances with another officer. "We're exploring all possibilities, Mrs. Brennan. We've called in search teams, and we'll be canvassing the neighborhood." Carol looked around the room, her eyes settling on Bill Peterson, who sat slumped in an armchair, his head in his hands. Danny stood beside him, still in his pajamas, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brennan," Danny sobbed. "I didn't hear anything. Tommy was right next to me, and then he was gone." Carol knelt down and pulled the boy into a hug. "It's not your fault, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong." But even as she comforted Danny, a cold dread was settling in her chest. Her son had vanished from a locked house without a trace. It was as if Tommy had simply evaporated into the night air. The search continued for weeks. Volunteers combed through the nearby woods. Police dogs tracked scents that led nowhere. And Carol's face became a familiar sight on local news programs, pleading for information about her missing son. But despite the massive effort, no trace of Tommy was ever found. The case that had started with such urgency gradually faded from the headlines. Detective Martinez retired. New cases took priority. And Carol was left with nothing but questions and a grief so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. Carol Brennan stood at her kitchen window, watching the morning joggers make their way down Elm Street. At 43, she looked older than her years, the lines around her eyes carved deep by 15 years of sleepless nights and endless worry. Her dark hair, now streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn since returning to work at the hospital 6 months after Tommy disappeared. The house felt different now. What had once been a warm family home had become a shrine to a missing child. Tommy's room remained exactly as he'd left it that October morning in 1989. His bed made, his homework from the last day of school still on his desk, his clothes hanging in the closet waiting for a boy who would never grow into them. Carol had tried dating a few times over the years, but it never worked. How could she explain to someone that she still set a place for her son at dinner? That she kept his favorite cereal in the pantry just in case? That every time the phone rang, her heart jumped with the possibility that this might be the call that brought Tommy home? The doorbell chimed, pulling Carol from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. 9:30 a.m. on a Saturday. Too early for solicitors, too late for emergencies. She made her way to the front door, peering through the peephole to see a familiar figure on her porch. Danny Peterson stood there, no longer the 10-year-old boy who had sobbed in her arms all those years ago. Now 25, he'd grown into a tall, lean man with his father's dark hair and something hollow in his eyes that Carol recognized all too well. The weight of that night had changed them all. "Danny," Carol said as she opened the door, genuine warmth in her voice despite the pain his presence always brought. "What brings you by?" "Hi, Mrs. Brennan." Danny's voice was deeper now, but she could still hear echoes of the scared child he'd been. "I hope it's not too early. I wanted to talk to you about something." Carol stepped aside to let him in, noticing how his hands trembled slightly as he wiped his feet on the mat. "Of course. Can I get you some coffee?" "That would be great, thanks." They settled in the living room, the same room where Carol had received countless updates from police officers, social workers, and private investigators over the years. A wall of missing person flyers and newspaper clippings served as a constant reminder of the search that had consumed her life. Danny's eyes drifted to a framed photo on the side table. Tommy and Danny at last year's Little League Championship, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grass stains on their uniforms and gap-toothed grins on their faces. "I still can't believe he's been gone this long," Danny said quietly. Carol nodded, that familiar ache settling in her chest. "Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like a lifetime." "Mrs. Brennan, there's something I need to tell you." Danny set down his coffee cup, his hands visibly shaking now. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Carol felt her heart rate spike. After 15 years, She'd learned to read the subtle signs that preceded revelations about Tommy's case. The way people avoided eye contact, the hesitation in their voices, the careful choice of words that somehow never quite said what she needed to hear. "What is it, Danny?" "The night Tommy disappeared, I didn't tell the police everything." Danny's voice was barely above a whisper. "I was scared, and my dad said it wouldn't matter anyway, that it would just confuse things." Carol leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the arm of her chair. "What didn't you tell them?" "Tommy didn't just disappear from his sleeping bag. I heard voices that night downstairs. My dad was talking to someone, but it wasn't my mom. It was a man's voice I didn't recognize." The room seemed to tilt around Carol. "Why didn't you tell anyone this before?" "Because my dad said I must have been dreaming. He said the TV was on downstairs, that I probably heard voices from a late-night movie." Danny looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt. "But Mrs. Brennan, I know what I heard, and there's more." Carol's throat felt tight. "More?" "The next morning, after the police left, I saw my dad putting something in his car trunk. It looked like a bag or a bundle. When I asked him about it, he said it was just garbage he was taking to the dump." "Did you see what was in it?" "No, but..." Danny paused as if gathering courage. "Mrs. Brennan, I think my dad knows what happened to Tommy." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Carol felt the room spinning, 15 years of assumptions crumbling around her. "Danny, that's a very serious accusation." "I know, and I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure. There's something else." Danny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object. "I found this in my dad's bedroom last week when I was helping him move some furniture." Carol's breath caught in her throat. In Danny's palm lay a small metal toy car, a red Corvette that she recognized immediately. She'd bought it for Tommy's 8th birthday. He always carried that in his pocket, Carol whispered, taking the car with trembling hands. "He said it was his good luck charm." "Mrs. Brennan, why would my dad have Tommy's toy car?" Carol stared at the tiny car, her mind reeling. "Where is your father now?" "He's putting the house up for sale, moving to Florida. He says he needs a fresh start." Danny paused. "Mrs. Brennan, I think he's running." Carol sat in her car outside Peterson's self-storage, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Danny sat in the passenger seat, nervously fidgeting with his keys. 3 days had passed since his revelation, 3 days of sleepless nights and careful planning. "Unit 247, Danny said for the 3rd time, staring at the key in his palm. "I found this key in his desk drawer when I was helping him pack. The tag has the storage company's name on it." Carol studied the sprawling complex of orange metal buildings. Rows upon rows of identical units stretched out before them, each one hiding someone's discarded memories or carefully preserved treasures. The thought that one of these anonymous storage units might contain answers about Tommy made her stomach churn. "Danny, are you sure about this? If we find something..." Carol's voice trailed off. After 15 years, the possibility of actually discovering the truth felt both desperately wanted and terrifyingly real. "Mrs. Brennan, I have to know. I've lived with this guilt for 15 years. If my dad hurt Tommy, I need to face that." Carol nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. They got out of the car and made their way through the maze of storage units, checking numbers until they found 247. It was a medium-sized unit, about the size of a one-car garage with a heavy-duty padlock securing the roll-up door. Danny inserted the key with hands that shook visibly. The lock clicked open. "Whatever we find in here," Carol said, placing a hand on Danny's shoulder, "it's not your fault. You were just a child." Danny nodded and grabbed the handle of the roll-up door. Together they lifted it. The unit was packed with furniture covered in dusty sheets, boxes stacked nearly to the ceiling, and the musty smell of things long forgotten. A narrow pathway led deeper into the space, flanked by the accumulated possessions of what looked like decades of storage. "How are we going to find anything in here?" Carol asked, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of stuff. "I know my dad's system," Danny said, moving toward the back of the unit. "He labels everything. If there's something here that shouldn't be, it'll be in the back where no one would look." They worked their way deeper into the storage unit, moving boxes and furniture to create a wider path. The air grew thicker and Carol found herself breathing through her mouth to avoid the smell of decay and neglect. "Mrs. Brennan," Danny's voice came from the very back of the unit, tight with tension. "You need to see this." Carol squeezed past a covered chair and found Danny standing in front of a small section that had been carefully organized and separated from the rest of the storage unit's contents. 3 boxes sat on a shelf, each labeled in Bill Peterson's neat handwriting: camping gear 1987, tools, garage, and misc items. "These labels don't match," Danny said, pointing to the boxes. "My dad never went camping, and his tools are all in his garage at home." Carol felt her pulse racing as Danny reached for the box labeled misc items. The tape holding it closed had yellowed with age, suggesting it had been sealed for many years. "Danny, maybe we should call the police before we—" "I have to see," Danny interrupted, his voice breaking. "I have to know what my father did." He peeled away the tape and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags, were items that made Carol's knees buckle. She grabbed onto Danny's arm to steady herself. Tommy's Spider-Man backpack, the one he'd carried to school every day, the one he'd been so proud of because it was just like Peter Parker's. "Oh my God," Carol whispered, reaching for the backpack with trembling hands. Beneath the backpack were more items. Tommy's wallet with his school ID card still inside, a Cubs baseball cap that Carol had given him for his 9th birthday, and a small notebook where Tommy had been practicing his cursive writing. But it was the last item in the box that made Danny sink to his knees. A child's t-shirt, once white but now stained dark with something that looked like dried blood. "Mrs. Brennan," Danny said, his voice barely audible. "This is what Tommy was wearing that night. I remember because he was so excited about the glow-in-the-dark design." Carol stared at the shirt, at the cartoon dinosaur that had once glowed green in the dark, now barely visible beneath the stains. The reality of what she was looking at hit her like a physical blow. "He's dead," she said, the words coming out in a broken whisper. "My son is dead." Danny wrapped his arms around her as she collapsed, her sobs echoing in the confined space of the storage unit. 15 years of hope, of believing that somehow Tommy might still be alive somewhere, crumbled in an instant. "I'm so sorry," Danny kept repeating. "I'm so sorry. I should have told someone. I should have known." When Carol's initial wave of grief subsided, she pulled back and looked at Danny with eyes that held a new determination. "We need to call the police," she said. "But first, we need to check those other boxes." The camping gear box contained rope, duct tape, and a shovel that showed signs of use. The tools box held items that clearly weren't tools at all: plastic sheeting, lime, and rubber gloves. "He planned this," Carol said, her voice hollow with shock. "This wasn't some accident or moment of rage. He planned to kill my son." Danny was crying now, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. "Why would he do this? Tommy was his friend. He was my best friend." Carol pulled out her phone with hands that barely worked. As she dialed 911, one terrible question consumed her thoughts. How long had Bill Peterson been planning to murder her son? Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the storage unit within 20 minutes of Carol's call, followed closely by the crime scene team and the coroner's office. As the investigators photographed and cataloged each item, Carol found herself reliving that terrible October night through a completely different lens. "Mrs. Brennan," Detective Chen said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask you some questions while the details are fresh." Carol nodded, though she felt anything but fresh. She felt ancient, like she'd aged decades in the span of a few hours. "How well did you know Bill Peterson before your son's disappearance?" "Very well. He and Danny's mother, Susan, were our closest friends. After my divorce, Bill was like an uncle to Tommy. He helped with baseball practice, took the boys to movies." Carol's voice trailed off as she realized how perfectly positioned Bill had been to gain her trust. Had Tommy ever expressed any discomfort around Mr. Peterson? Never. He loved going over there. That's what made this so. "I never suspected." Carol couldn't finish the sentence. Detective Chen made notes, her expression professionally neutral. "We're going to need to locate Mr. Peterson immediately. Do you know where he might be?" "Danny said he was moving to Florida," Carol replied, "but I don't know where exactly." An officer approached Detective Chen and whispered something in her ear. The detective's expression darkened. "Mrs. Brennan, we just ran Mr. Peterson's name through our system. He purchased a plane ticket to Costa Rica, one way. The flight leaves at 11:30 tonight." Carol felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "He's running. We're issuing an arrest warrant now, and we'll have officers at the airport. But first, we need to find out exactly where he is." Danny, who had been quiet since the discovery, suddenly looked up. "He's at the house, packing. He's supposed to leave for the airport at 8 p.m. Detective Chen checked her watch. "That gives us 3 hours. Danny, I need you to call your father. Don't let on that anything's wrong. Just tell him you want to say goodbye before he leaves." "I don't think I can do that," Danny said, his voice shaking. "I can't pretend everything's normal." "Danny," Carol said firmly, "you're the only one who can stop him from getting away. If he makes it to Costa Rica, we might never get justice for Tommy." Danny took a deep breath and nodded. With trembling fingers, he dialed his father's number. "Dad, it's me. Yeah, I know you're busy packing. I just wanted to come by and say goodbye before you leave for the airport." "What time?" "Okay, I'll be there around 7. "Love you too, Dad." Danny hung up and immediately looked like he was going to be sick. "You did great," Detective Chen assured him. "Now, here's what we're going to do." The plan was simple but dangerous. Danny would go to the house as scheduled, keeping his father occupied while police surrounded the property. Under no circumstances was Danny to confront his father directly or let on that they knew about the storage unit. If he suspects anything, Detective Chen warned, he could become violent. Your job is just to keep him in the house until we can get there. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, Carol found herself sitting in an unmarked police car 2 blocks from the Peterson house, watching officers take their positions. The same white colonial with green shutters that had once represented safety and friendship now looked sinister in the fading light. "Units in position," came a voice over the radio. "Danny's going in now," said another officer. Carol watched as the young man who had been her son's best friend walked up the familiar driveway, carrying the weight of 15 years of secrets on his shoulders. Her heart pounded as she saw the front door open and Danny disappear inside. "Subject is in the house," reported an officer with binoculars. "Lights on in the living room and kitchen." 10 minutes passed, then 20. Carol's anxiety was reaching a breaking point when her phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "He's packing in bedroom. Seems normal. How much longer?" Detective Chen radioed for the team to move in. Carol watched as officers emerged from their hiding spots and surrounded the house. The front door team positioned themselves on either side of the entrance. "Police, open up!" Detective Chen's voice boomed through a megaphone. Through the living room window, Carol could see shadows moving rapidly. Then the lights went out. "Shit," muttered the officer next to Carol. "He knows." Suddenly the back door burst open and a figure ran toward the woods behind the house. "Suspect fleeing on foot toward the tree line," an officer shouted into his radio. Carol watched in horror as Bill Peterson, the man who had helped her son with homework and taught him to throw a curveball, disappeared into the darkness. "What about Danny?" Carol asked frantically. "Team 2, status on the house," Detective Chen radioed. "House is secure. We have the young man. He's safe." Relief flooded through Carol, followed immediately by rage that Bill Peterson might escape justice. But the manhunt was swift and efficient. Within an hour, police dogs had tracked Peterson to a creek about a mile from his house, where he was found hiding in a drainage culvert, soaked and shivering. As Carol watched the police car carrying Bill Peterson drive past, she found herself staring into the face of her son's killer. Even through the car window, she could see that he was crying. 15 years too late, she thought bitterly. 15 years too late. The interrogation room at the Millbrook Police Department was small and windowless, designed to feel claustrophobic. Bill Peterson sat across from Detective Chen, his hands cuffed to the metal table, his expensive sweater torn from his flight through the woods. Carol watched through the one-way mirror, her hands pressed flat against the glass. After 15 years of wondering, she was finally going to learn what had happened to her son. "Mr. Peterson," Detective Chen began, "you've been read your rights. Do you understand them?" Bill nodded, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. "We found your storage unit, Bill. We found Tommy's belongings. We found evidence of what you did to him." Bill's shoulders began to shake. "I never meant for it to happen. Tell me what did happen." Bill was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Tommy saw something he shouldn't have seen." "What did he see?" "I had a problem. A gambling problem. I owed some very dangerous people a lot of money." Bill looked up for the first time. "I was desperate. I started taking pictures." Carol felt her blood run cold. "What kind of pictures, Bill?" "Of the boys. During sleepovers. When they were sleeping." Bill's voice broke. "I was selling them online. It was supposed to be harmless. Just pictures. But the buyers wanted more." Detective Chen's voice remained steady despite the horrific nature of the confession. "And Tommy discovered this. That night, he got up to use the bathroom. I thought both boys were asleep. I was in Danny's room with my camera and Tommy walked in." Bill put his head in his hands. "He asked me what I was doing. He was so innocent. He didn't understand. But I knew he would tell someone. I couldn't let that happen. So you killed him. I didn't plan to. I just meant to keep him quiet until I could figure out what to do. I put my hand over his mouth, but he kept struggling, trying to scream. I pressed harder, and then he stopped moving. Carol sank into a chair, the full horror of her son's final moments washing over her. Tommy had died afraid and confused, at the hands of someone he trusted. What did you do with his body? I panicked. I wrapped him in plastic and put him in the trunk of my car. I drove out to the old quarry and I buried him there. Why did you keep his belongings? Bill was crying openly now. I don't know. I was going to throw them away, but I couldn't. It felt like throwing Tommy away. Detective Chen leaned forward. Bill, how many other children did you photograph? Just Danny and Tommy that one time. I swear I never touched them. I never hurt anyone else. Except for murdering a 10-year-old boy. Bill flinched as if he'd been slapped. I know what I did was unforgivable. I've lived with it every day for 15 years. I never had a moment's peace. But you were willing to let Tommy's mother suffer all this time. You were willing to let her believe her son might still be alive somewhere. I was afraid. I knew if I confessed, my whole family would be destroyed. Danny would hate me. Susan would leave me. I thought maybe it would be better if everyone just moved on. Carol stood up abruptly, no longer able to listen. She walked out of the observation room and into the hallway, where Danny was sitting on a bench, staring at the floor. Did you hear? She asked. Danny nodded without looking up. All of it. They sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to process the magnitude of what they'd learned. Mrs. Brennan, Danny finally said, I am so sorry. If I had been braver that night, if I had told the truth from the beginning. Danny, you were 10 years old. None of this is your fault, but I could have saved you 15 years of not knowing. Carol put her arm around the young man who had been her son's best friend. You found the truth eventually. That's what matters now. What happens next? Now we bring Tommy home. 6 months later, Carol stood beside a small grave in Millbrook Cemetery, watching as workers carefully lowered a child-sized casket into the ground. The autumn air was crisp, just like it had been on the last day she'd seen Tommy alive. The quarry search had taken 3 weeks. When they finally found Tommy's remains, Carol had felt a mixture of devastation and relief. Her son was finally coming home. Danny stood beside her, along with Susan Peterson, who had divorced Bill immediately after his confession. The woman had aged a decade in 6 months, the weight of learning that she'd been married to a child killer and predator taking its toll. I should have known, Susan whispered as the casket disappeared from view. I should have seen the signs. We all should have, Carol replied. But Bill was very good at hiding who he really was. The trial had been swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence and his own confession, Bill Peterson had pled guilty to second-degree murder and possession of child pornography. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Detective Chen had been thorough in her investigation, finding evidence that Bill had been selling photographs online for nearly 2 years before Tommy's death. Several other predators had been arrested as part of the broader investigation, a small measure of justice for other potential victims. As the graveside service concluded, Carol placed a bouquet of sunflowers, Tommy's favorite, on the fresh earth. The headstone was simple. Thomas Michael Brennan, beloved son, forever in our hearts. Mrs. Brennan? Danny approached hesitantly. I wanted you to know that I'm starting college next month. Psychology. I want to help kids who have been through trauma. Carol smiled through her tears. Tommy would be proud of you. I hope so. I think about him every day, about the man he would have become. Me too. As the other mourners began to leave, Carol remained by the grave. For 15 years she had carried the weight of not knowing, the terrible hope that somehow her son might return. Now, finally, she could begin to grieve properly. I found you, baby, she whispered to the headstone. I finally found you. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and for just a moment Carol could almost hear the echo of a 10-year-old boy's laughter. She would carry that sound with her for the rest of her life, along with the memory of a child who had trusted the wrong person and paid for it with his life. But she would also carry the knowledge that justice had been served, that Bill Peterson would never hurt another child, and that her son could finally rest in peace. As Carol walked away from the cemetery, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years. Closure. The questions that had haunted her for so long finally had answers, even if those answers were more horrible than she could have imagined. Tommy was home, and that, after everything, was enough. Epilogue. 5 years later, Carol stood in the lobby of the Millbrook Children's Advocacy Center, adjusting the small pin on her jacket, a sunflower worn in Tommy's memory. At 48, she had found a new purpose in life, dedicating herself to helping other families navigate the aftermath of crimes against children. The center bore a small plaque by the entrance, the Thomas Brennan Memorial Fund for Missing Children. It wasn't much, but it was something positive that had come from the worst tragedy imaginable. Danny, now a licensed therapist specializing in childhood trauma, volunteered at the center on weekends. Together, they had helped dozens of families over the years, families who were living through their own versions of hell. Mrs. Brennan, a young mother approached, clutching a missing person flyer. "I'm Sarah Martinez. My daughter disappeared 3 days ago." Carol took the woman's hands in hers, feeling the familiar weight of someone else's desperate hope. "We're going to help you find her," she said with quiet conviction, "whatever it takes. Because that's what you did for other people's children. You never gave up. You never stopped looking, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, you brought them home." Tommy had taught her that. Even in death, her son was still helping to save lives.